My name is Bart Preneel. I'm professor at the University of Leuven, and I had a research group on applied cryptography and privacy. So Europe has always a bit of a schizophrenic attitude on privacy and security. Of course, we all are aware that privacy is important. Europe has approved GDPR, and de facto this has become the privacy legislation for the world. And Europe also has historically been funding a lot of privacy research. For example, there is the PRIME and PRIME Live project and ABC for Trust. It was actually in total 12 years of research on anonymous credentials. And also the Panoramics project on mixed networks that actually gave rise to the NIM company. At policy level in Europe, there is different Directorate Generals, DGs, and there is one for Interior, and there is one for Communications, Connect, and Home, and they have typically very different views on what Europe should do. And this then ends up being fought out in the Parliament and in the Council in different levels, where some people in Europe advocate privacy and privacy technologies, and others actually want to get more access and more control to communications, and in general it leads to very ambiguous policies. But the core of the matter is there can be no real open debate about these things, because in the end, when push comes to shove, Europe says, or the member states come in and say, this is touching our national security and this cannot be the European competence. And so a lot of debates are actually not held or not held in the open. Recently, there was some focus on the eIDAS debate, so the European regulation for digital identity. It's a good idea that you would have one app which actually has open source code. This is very good. And that would actually be used for identification. So by itself, I think it's a good principle. There is, of course, many problems. As scientists, we said, if you do this, then you have to have extra privacy measures so that every time you use this app for a different company or a different service, it gives you a different identifier, that you not become linkable. You can't have, on the one hand, GDPR and cookie directives, and then issue everybody a wallet that gives unique identifier that's the same in every application, right? That's and this is more or less reflected in eIDAS, but then what about linking in the same application? What if actually I visit the same website of service? Can I have a different identity every time? There, eIDAS actually, in the last versions, became much more privacy unfriendly. Making regulation in Europe is very complex. So the Commission takes the initiative, the Parliament then develops the law like any other parliament in a slow and complex process. But when they're done, then actually the trilogue happens, and the Commission, the Parliament, and the member states start talking and negotiating about a lot of details again, and this is called the trilogue. And then afterwards, the final proposal goes back to the Parliament. And so for eIDAS, actually, a lot of strange things happened during this trilogue. One thing is this unlinkability suddenly became optional. And so this is definitely something that made researchers concerned. The other thing which really bizarre was in this trilogue, what was introduced was kind of the obligation of web browsers to introduce government certificate keys, so that in fact web browsers were forced to trust government CAs. And there was a very big response against this. In the end, some mitigations were added to the legislation, but they ended up in the recital and not in the body of the text. And then there was even more protests, and now the Commission has kind of added the declaration. They said, we really don't want to undermine the web ecosystem. And this is what the Parliament has approved. So I think now we'll have to see what's going to happen. So this is only one small step. Now there will be regulations implementing the details of eIDAS. And of course, all the member states will roll out apps, which will be likely open source, so we can look at them. So we now have to carefully monitor what's happening. How much data do these apps collect? Are they linkable? Are they unlinkable? And of course, also the same thing with the browser ecosystem. So more or less, eIDAS imposes browsers to recognize government certificates. They're going to issue certificates, qualified certificates for government services or for government-approved certificates. What is going to happen there in terms of ecosystem? Which security measures will they take? Will there be abuses there? So it's lots of, I think, work for activists and academics to keep a close eye on what actually is happening. Legal protections are one thing. I prefer solutions where actually data is protected by technology, because there's one thing to say it's forbidden to use your data for X, or it's forbidden to transfer data to country Y. I think it's even better if no one has your data, or your data is not collected or stored and it cannot be abused afterwards. And so what NIM does is very specifically for communications or transactions, it hides the identities of the communicating parties. So it's not only enough to hide what they're saying, it also hides for eavesdroppers, people who intercept the connection, can be the ISP, can be also an intelligence service, can also be, of course, your neighbor who is listening to your Wi-Fi. It doesn't hide the content, but it also hides who's talking to whom. We have, of course, for this, there is the Tor network. That's one solution, which has strengths and weaknesses. Many people use VPNs. VPNs rely on a VPN provider, and more or less they shift the trust in the VPN provider. So the VPN provider will actually hide your identity to third parties or your location, more or less, your IP address, but then it knows everything about you. And of course, a VPN provider is a very attractive target for governments to take control of, because actually people who have things to hide go hide all their data with the VPN provider. And so something I read is that, for example, in China, the government owns many VPN providers. It's actually what the Chinese government wants. They actually want to find out which citizens want to hide their data for the government, and then they buy the VPN provider and they have access to all the data again. So what NIM is doing is more sophisticated. It's a VPN with 2 nodes. Where actually there is an entry node and an exit node, which means that actually who talking to whom is not known unless those 2 nodes would collude. In general, NIM also has sophisticated incentive mechanisms to have many players help there. It can kind of an open market where everybody can contribute rather than just having everything in the hands of one player. And of course, NIM has additional services, mixed networks, which are more sophisticated. They give you more delay in using the internet, so they're a bit less user-friendly for things like browsing or for streaming services. They may be a bit slower, have more latency, but if you're really worried about privacy, then you can also use those services on top.